Hello. Thank you to the Manitoba Fitness Council for inviting me to speak upon my research. And thank you to those who have tuned in today in order to listen to me talk a little bit about the things that I've learned while conducting research with people of a larger size. My name is Andrea Bombach, and this is work that I did while I was undertaking my PhD at the University of Manitoba. Since then, I've bounced around to a few different institutions. My background is in population health science and in medical anthropology. And today we're going to be talking about what we can learn from persons of a larger size about how we can improve public health for people of all sizes. And just as a quick note on language in this area is very sensitive and there's a lot of debate on the issue. And so I let my participants sort of identify however they wanted. Part of the study criteria was that individuals self-identify as having a body mass index of 30 or above. So fitting that classification of what we would term obesity either now or in the past. But some individuals didn't like that term. So some individuals preferred terms like fat or larger person. So I'm going to probably be bouncing between saying things like obese and fat and larger person. And that's just with the intent of being as inclusive and non-pejorative as possible when we're talking about these more sensitive issues. And so the title of today's presentation, Smile at a Fat Person Exercising, was actually something that one of my participants said she felt would help to improve the public health of people of a larger size, as well as people of all sizes. So in Canada, we know that just under a quarter of adults are considered obese. So that is having that body mass index of 30 or above. And the body mass index is a measure of weight over height. And it's important that we talk about the BMI, we understand the limitations of the BMI. Every time I go to an obesity conference, there's a talk about the limitations of the BMI, and yet we persist in using it. Probably the most important limitation that we recognize about the BMI is that it is meant for population usage, not for individual usage, but we persist in using it that way. The BMI tells you more about a population level's health than it does about an individual's health. Trying to apply it to an individual is actually a statistical fallacy that we call the ecological fallacy. Another important limitation that we recognize about the BMI that's especially important in a fitness context is that it doesn't distinguish between lean mass and fat mass, so it's actually quite a poor measure to use with individuals who are quite athletic or quite physically active. It's also a poor measure to use often with racial minorities, as well as being a poor measure to use with people who have what we might term non-standard limb length. And this can be entire groups of people. Still, we continue to use it, and when we talk about obesity, what we're generally talking about is people that fall into that category of 30 or above. Individuals who have a body mass index between 25 and 29.9 then are also labeled overweight. And so we know that, again, on that population level, obesity can be associated with any number of health conditions. And I think we're all quite familiar with, we see this in the newspaper all the time. We see this in public health documents all the time, that obesity is associated with things like certain cancers, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension, for example. But what we tend to discuss less often is the widespread weight discrimination to which individuals of a larger size are subject. It's been reported in the healthcare system, in school, work, and in social situations, and in interpersonal relationships. We know that there's moderate to high anti-fat bias, for example, among clinicians, and among trainees too, so it's spreading into a younger generation as well. There's talk about how much more difficult it even is to get into grad school if you have a larger body, and there's been research done in this area. And there's often talk about a wage penalty for being of a larger size, particularly amongst women. And it's important to note that this kind of stigma has spread globally as well. As an anthropologist, we used to talk about nations and particular groups that were considered more fat positive. But with increasing westernization, we see that less and less often. And more often than not now, even what we consider these more fat positive cultures are starting to adopt anti-fat bias. And this kind of bias or stigma is associated with stereotypes that people who have larger bodies are worse. So on a scale from good to bad, they are designated bad, that they're lazier and less motivated, which is certainly important in a fitness context, but also even that they're stupider and less honest than their thinner counterparts. So I think that we tend to think that in public health and in biomedicine spheres that we tend to talk about obesity in sort of these clinical and neutral terms, and therefore we're not sending out any kind of negative messages about what it is to live in a larger body. But I think you can tell from the images at the bottom of my screen that we do send out implicit messages about what it means to be fat and what it means to be thin. And I took these from the Center for Disease Control in the United States and from Manitoba's public health website. And in fact, that male torso used to be in a television ad that had to be removed from screens. Across that man's torso, it said things like second helpings and dessert and not taking the stairs, for example. And there were actually protests from an American eating disorder group that said that they felt that this was stigmatizing and could motivate disordered eating. Also, in public health circles as well as in the media, when we talk about obesity prevalence, we tend to do so in terms that we would call sensationalist or catastrophic. It's always presented as being an epidemic or a crisis or a time bomb. And we see this even when we're, this is the frame that's used even when we're talking about how obesity rates are stabilizing, which they are, or even declining in some sectors. There's no such thing as a happy obesity story. It always has to be presented as being a crisis. We also tend to present it as being caused by a simplistic energy imbalance model. So how often have we heard or how often have we said that it's simply a matter of calories in exceeding calories out? We know that this doesn't reflect the complex socioeconomic and cultural circumstances in which individuals live, but we're starting to understand that it doesn't necessarily reflect some of the complex and certainly individually variable processes of things like weight regain. There are more complicated biological impeti behind things like weight gain as well. Still, the media's most common framing of obesity is that it is a matter of personal responsibility. And this is very important because this is a kind of causal attribution that we know can exacerbate stigma. And of course, we need to consider stigma because stigma can have debilitating direct and indirect health effects. And this is true of any kind of stigma, but we know that weight bias exposure can predispose individuals to things like disordered eating, poor mental health outcomes, elevated stress response, avoidance of the healthcare system, and decreased physical activity. It's also important that we consider these issues because the actual relationship between things like fat, fitness, and health is characterized by more nuance and uncertainty than how it is often presented. For example, there are what we term obesity paradoxes. And so these are findings that would seem to contradict what we might consider obesity epidemiological orthodoxy. And these are actually fairly consistent findings in the literature. And while these themselves might sometimes be contradicted, what again they point to is the fact that there is a certain degree of uncertainty with respect to this kind of work that we don't often see, especially on that individual level. So for example, we know that in chronic disease populations and amongst older adults, It's often individuals with obesity who tend to live longer. Having an overweight weight status, so that intermediate weight status between what might be termed normal or healthy weight and obesity, carries with it the lowest risk of mortality. You can be obese and still be metabolically healthy, and you can certainly be thin and be metabolically unhealthy. And individuals who are both obese and have a high level of cardiorespiratory fitness tend to often have a lower mortality risk compared to their unfit, thinner peers. What I think, though, is most important that we consider when we're talking about things like obesity and health and weight loss is that the vast majority of individuals who are currently obese are going to stay obese. Weight loss dieting is widely inefficacious. The vast majority of individuals who lose weight do so only temporarily and then wind up regaining all of the weight that they lost. Approximately 2/3 will wind up regaining more weight than they initially lost. We used to think that this was just because individuals were going on these finite diets. They weren't making lifestyle choices. So this was just a sign of them lacking willpower. What we're starting to understand, though, is that there's a lot of homeostatic stimuli that operate totally involuntarily on a physiological level to induce people to wind up regaining weight. Individuals who, for example, individuals who have lost weight don't burn calories at the same rate as individuals who were always thin. And individuals who have lost weight will also experience changes in hormones as well that affect their ability to feel full and their ability to feel hunger. So all of these things can help result in weight regain. And the individuals who have managed to lose weight and keep it off, and this is an ever-shrinking number, have had to make major lifestyle changes. So there's anecdotal talk about things like lawyers that have become fitness professionals because this basically becomes a full-time job for a lot of individuals. There's rigorous monitoring of one's weight and eating, anecdotal talk about having to travel everywhere that you go with a scale to ensure that you are always keeping very vigilant track of your weight and your diet. On average, individuals who are trying to sustain weight loss eat just over 1,300 kilocalories per day. And some cluster analyses have actually found quite high proportions of these individuals do things like skip meals, have high rates of stress and high rates of depression and body dissatisfaction. So the idea that small changes will lead to weight loss, especially sustained weight loss, is certainly erroneous for the vast majority of individuals, and also that it's necessarily going to produce better health-related quality of life, especially in mental health dimensions, is not necessarily true either. In part, these kinds of findings have led to the Health at Every Size movement. And the Health at Every Size movement argues for a greater focus on improved self-care, including engaging in enjoyable physical activity and trying to eat a healthy, intuitive diet, as well as body acceptance, but less of a focus on trying to produce weight loss as an outcome. So with all of that as background, the purpose of my research is to use critical ethnographic methods, which is a method that's derived from anthropology, with the intention of trying to get at an insider's view of a particular issue, and it's often done in sort of a particular cultural context, to explore obese individuals' perceptions of health and obesity and their lifestyles, quality of life, and behaviors across time and different weight trajectories. I did this over the course of about 1 year in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And this was termed a multi-sited ethnography. So that is, I asked my participants about sites that were especially meaningful to them as larger persons, and I went with them to those sites and participated in a variety of different kinds of activities with them while taking detailed field notes as a form of data. This was also a form of longitudinal qualitative research. I started off doing one interview with all 15 of my participants, and then I selected a sub-sample of 5 individuals that I followed over the course of a year and re-interviewed 3 more times on a seasonal basis. So I was looking for adults who self-identify as being obese or as being previously obese according to the body mass index. And I did so through posters at multiple sites as well as mailing lists, like listservs. One of those listservs was affiliated with healthcare, and that meant that quite a number of my participants were actually in some way affiliated with the healthcare system. So this included everyone from frontline healthcare providers to individuals who worked in reception or admin or finance. I also conducted a form of purposive sampling. So that is, I was looking at a maximum of variation in perspectives on health and obesity, rather than assuming that this is sort of a monolithic view and that everyone feels the same way about their bodies or about these issues. So I didn't stop recruiting until I had individuals who were hoping to lose weight, individuals who told me that they were prioritizing diet and exercise but weren't focusing on trying to lose weight, and then individuals who were more politicized fat acceptors and were more concerned with sort of looking at these issues as a social justice issue. So one limitation of my study is that most of the individuals were white women. However, there was a fair bit of range in terms of age, in terms of socioeconomic status, and in terms of living situations. Most importantly, with respect to the aims of my study, I did get at a fairly wide range in perspectives on fat, health, and weight loss. At the start of data collection, and of course these are somewhat arbitrary categories and people shifted back and forth over data collection, but at the start about 1/3 were probably aiming more for fat acceptance. We're trying to achieve a level of body acceptance rather than necessarily prioritizing weight loss. And then about 2/3 of individuals were hoping to lose weight or to try and sustain weight loss that they had experienced in the past. For the repeated interviews, I selected a subsample of 5 persons who were largely reflective of that overall sample in terms of their sociodemographics, but who had the widest range in terms of their perspectives on fat and health, and also their different histories with respect to weight. So participants were asked about places in which they felt accepted or places in which they felt stigmatized or that were otherwise meaningful to them as larger persons. And then I went with them to those sites and participated in a variety of different kinds of activities. So I went grocery shopping with participants. I went to participants' family homes. I participated in menu planning and meal preparation. I was introduced to participants' online fitness communities. I ate with my participants in a variety of different venues, and I participated in a number of different kinds of fitness activities, including individual fitness activities and group fitness activities. Three main themes emerged from this analysis: the importance of function and mobility, compulsion, addiction, and validation, and then the social impacts of weight-related changes. So I think in all 39 interviews that I conducted for this study, function and mobility was mentioned. This was very obviously the #1 health concern of participants. Participants tended to be quite active or could describe a time in their past when they had been quite active and a desire to recapture that level of activity. And they were very concerned about the effect of aging, especially in a larger body, and how that might relate to their ability to continue to be active in the future and to engage in preferred activities. So their vocations or family and social interactions, and to do so independently and without pain. I want to be able to play with my son. I want to be able to chase my son. He gets so excited when you go chasing after him, or when he can chase after you, or just spontaneously get up off the floor and catch a rolling ball down the hallway or whatever, and I find that I have troubles doing that with him. I've talked about this in places like Australia and New Orleans, and they don't understand what I mean when I talk about Winnipeg's extreme winters. So I often have to include pictures of snow, but I think this audience will understand this a little bit better. These kinds of concerns could be very much exasperated during the winter months. During the winter months, individuals experienced a lower decrease in mood, inability to engage in health behaviors, and in overall health. And this was particularly true for those who had a pre-existing mobility or function issue, or for those who were of lower socioeconomic status who might not have access to a vehicle. They could often find that large snowfalls and the bitter cold could really impede on their ability to engage socially and in physical activity. So those participants who were hoping to lose weight tended to talk about their relationship to food in terms of addiction or coping or stress. Being fat isn't a choice. It's psychological and it's an addiction, and there's nothing for fat people out there. You can't go to the doctor or you can go to counseling because you're anorexic or bulimic, but there's nowhere to go for counseling because you're fat, and it's not fair and it's not right. So maybe this will change that. Somewhat alarmingly, though, individuals who were trying to lose weight or individuals who were describing their past attempts to lose weight often used terms that were just as evocative of addiction or compulsion as how they described those kinds of eating behaviors. And in fact, close to 1/3 of participants reported a history of disordered eating for which they had had to seek out medical attention. And it was often when they had sought out this medical attention that they wound up being exposed to and adopting more of a health at every size perspective. When I was not stable and not in a positive place with my body image of myself and not feeling that health at every size was a viable option for me, it really kept me up at night because it becomes a demon, right? Trying to lose weight at all costs becomes all-encompassing and obsessive for me. It's something that no longer keeps me up at night, which is a real freedom and contributes massively to a quality of life. And these participants also tended to talk about how they felt that their previous disordered eating and their previous extreme attempts to lose weight through restrictive eating and often through excessive exercise had resulted in effects to their metabolism that now hindered any kind of attempt to lose weight. They felt that their present size was in part a product of these past extreme attempts to lose weight, and they didn't ever want to re-engage in these kinds of behaviors for fear of re-triggering these kinds of disordered eating behaviors and the very negative health effects that this had on them. Participants talked about things like having dangerously low blood pressure when they were trying to lose weight, having their hair fall out, losing their periods, for example. Participants also often talked about a need for validation for their efforts, whether or not this was in losing weight or just trying to make lifestyle changes. And again, they used terms that were very sort of reflective of addiction or compulsion. One participant even told me she was addicted to being told she was doing a good job. I heard that I'm a collector of awards from one participant. So they very actively tried to seek out this kind of validation for the efforts that they were necessarily making. And for some, they viewed this as being sort of a positive thing. It helped them to build community. It was just sort of signposts of progress on their health journey. But for some, they thought that this was potentially negative. that it was resulting in them sort of engaging in these more obsessive compulsive behaviors and was potentially hindering their progress, potentially having negative mental health effects as well. It was also really significant for individuals who were trying to maintain weight loss. As one of my participants said, he was now just striving for mediocrity because he no longer received the kind of valorization that he had in the past when he was actively losing weight. So he tried to get around this by, for example, posting fat photos of himself onto Facebook to try and generate renewed responses for his bodily changes. So all of my participants described experiencing stigma in some capacity of their lives, and differing weight perspectives and trajectories substantially altered participants' social relationships. It really had profound effects. There was a lot of talk of marriage and relationship dissolution with weight gain. One participant even talked about losing a friend when she lost weight because the friend no longer received the confidence boost from being around a larger woman. A lot of tension could enter into families if an individual tried to introduce lifestyle changes that weren't endorsed by their partners or their children. Participants talked about how difficult it could be to eat in public, either having to be around foods that they felt they couldn't control themselves around, or if they were trying to adopt more of a science acceptance perspective, for example, and just eat when they were hungry and eat what they wanted, they would often generate comments. People talked about going out with their toddlers to buy ice cream and then having to put up with people's looks, or the looks that they would receive in grocery stores or if they ordered foods in restaurants, for example. I lost a lot of my life from being heavy. I lost marriage to my child's father. I lost my career. I lost the pleasure of social interaction. I've had to deal with embarrassment and humiliation every time I got stuck in a chair in a restaurant and everything like that. You know, people glaring at me when I get on an airplane because they don't want me to sit next to them. So they got too much space. Why does anyone think I chose that? It's a response to how much I was hurting from things that I couldn't even deal with in my life. So one relationship that was very important to participants was the clinician and patient relationship. And I think in some ways, some of these findings could be extended into a fitness professional and client relationship as well. And participants talked about this in terms of their own experience. And then for those who worked in more clinical environments, they talked about things that they had witnessed. And they talked about how these kinds of relationships could manifest in both harmful and beneficial ways. So those more harmful relationships were characterized by a sense of reductionism. So that is being told to eat less and exercise more as though they'd never thought of that before or never tried it in the past. Or a sense of labeling, so feeling like their whole identity had been subsumed under being the fat patient, or taking that weight focus. So if participants wanted to talk about something wholly unrelated to their size, coming in with a cold, for example, and somehow having that equated to being obese, and somehow having all of their own concerns just sort of dismissed in favor of being told to lose weight. Every little thing in society adds up to the obesity. It isn't just overeating, it's not sleeping, it's a money issue too. And I think it's not just the person who's obese that needs help, it's the whole community that needs to recognize it as a disease. And the doctors, I think they see it as laziness. In my situation, they laughed at me and said, well, why doesn't your foot work? Why doesn't this work? She's just a fat old lady. On the other hand, more beneficial relationships were often characterized by a sense of holism. So for participants, this often meant a focus on mental and social well-being, not just physical health, as well as the use of other kinds of diagnostic criteria beyond simply the body mass index. Participants knew and understood things like blood pressure and lipids, and they wanted to talk about those issues as well. And there was a lot of criticism of the BMI, and a lot of sense almost that participants were haunted by the BMI. They talked about the fact that it didn't matter how much effort they put into things, and it didn't matter even how much weight some of them had lost, or how healthy they strived to be without necessarily losing weight. VMI was always there to remind them that they were considered diseased and abnormal. And some participants talked about what it was like having to see it every time that they went to their fitness center, that they otherwise viewed as being a safe space, and constantly having to be reminded that even though they came here every day and worked so hard, they still fell into this diseased, abnormal category. Participants also talked about the benefits of having a trusting relationship. And in those more negative relationships, there was often talk about leaving your doctor's office and feeling that you had been called a liar. And some participants would vet their clinicians to see whether or not they would adhere to their sort of rules of care. And this could include things like not being weighed in a clinical encounter or being allowed to be the first person to bring up weight. Rachel felt that the clinic that she worked at was particularly sensitive to persons of a larger size. Health is promoted and people aren't stigmatized because they're obese. They try to help everybody. They're sincerely trying and doing evidence-based stuff and actually making a difference. Evidence-based and science were very important to participants. Every side of the equation, even those who were really coming at this issue from a social justice standpoint, all marshaled science to their advantage. So participants really believed that any kind of health advice they received or any kind of fitness advice that they received should really be grounded in scientific fact. And participants often talked about the importance of their fitness professionals' credentials and their training and their education, and they would seek out fitness venues based on those criteria as well. So I performed another kind of analysis with my data because I had this, really this spectrum of different kinds of obesities, from self-loathing to fat acceptance. And I started to realize that there were patterns in my data. I could sort of map people out based on their hopes and their goals, their histories, their beliefs, their fears, their diets, and their social lives. People sort of started to fall into a particular kind of matrix. And this was often based on their current weight and their previous weight history and their social lives, the kind of stigma that they had encountered and the messages that they had heard. So I constructed what's called a Vivarian ideal type typology, which is a kind of method that's derived from sociology. And the intent of this is kind of to create archetypes of the kind of types that emerge from your data. But the intent of this isn't to further stereotype people. These are your results taken to their most extreme degree possible. And obviously in real life and amongst your participants, there's a far higher degree of nuance and ambiguity and ambivalence. But the types that sort of emerged from my data were the hopeful type, the despairing type, the resigned type, and then the accepting type. So those more hopeful types would have been currently losing weight or maintaining weight loss. And they presented themselves as being masters of their own body and sort of these champions of willpower. They tended to live very, very restrictive lifestyles, and there was often a very real sense of dread over the idea of potentially regaining weight. Despairing types, on the other hand, were often those who had never had sustained weight loss. They were either sort of chronically in a larger size or perpetual weight cyclers. And they tended to have internalized a lot of self-blame for their size. They believed that their size was the result of what they described as being their out-of-control eating habits or a lack of motivation to exercise. Resigned types, on the other hand, had similar weight trajectories to these more despairing types, but at this time they no longer viewed an inability to lose weight as being something that was their fault. They felt that this was either something that was innate to them or something that had developed over time that prevented them from being able to lose weight. So they thought that potentially weight loss might be beneficial for them, but it was kind of a futile endeavor. So they were going to try and accept their size as much as possible and to try and be as healthy as possible without weight loss. Acceptors, on the other hand, did not equate fatness with sickness, and they would have used the term fat. They felt that fat stigma was a social justice issue and what we should be focusing on instead of trying to get people to lose weight. And they often described what were quite traumatic attempts in the past to lose weight that had manifested into eating disorders. So my study wasn't designed to explicitly look at physical activity, but it came up extremely frequently during interviews when I asked participants about what health meant to them or what kind of activities they engaged in to improve health or quality of life. These are just some of the activities that were mentioned in interviews. I have no doubt that I'm missing some. Participants really were quite active in everything from marathons to triathlons, team sports. Many of them went to the gym and engaged in different kinds of training there. Aquatic fitness was mentioned, hiking, walking, cycling, outdoor activities, dancing, rollerblading, skiing, going to different kinds of fitness classes, yoga. Some of my participants even taught some of these classes. And I went with them and participated in some of these activities as well. So one thing that was very important for these participants, though, was trying to find a fitness venue or a fitness context, because it wasn't always sort of a discrete place, that would be considered accepting. And they talked about previous experiences in the past in which these contexts had been more stigmatizing for them. So what made a place accepting or stigmatizing was premised on the overt attitude of staff. So whether or not participants would feel that they were welcome there, that the staff recognized them as being someone that was interested in their fitness, in their health, and that that was a possibility for them. What was also very important for participants was the diversity of clientele that was already present. As one participant said, not being the only middle-aged woman, whether or not there's other large bodies present there or other persons with a disability. And this extended to advertisements as well. One of my participants talked about how frustrated she was that in something like Participation, it was always people who were already fit, or it was always thin people. So you never saw individuals making progress, or you never saw an individual in a larger body who was engaged in physical activity and enjoying themselves and having fun, for example. It's kind of intimidating. You're doing something that's making your body move in all sorts of ways that is not attractive. You feel like everyone's going to see this. So maybe if there were group classes so when you're in a group where you're going to have support, and then if that group were people who are like you, or if they're a certain weight like you, so that you don't feel like you're the only one. And this quote also calls to mind another important point that participants mentioned, which was the value of being able to do things with someone else, whether or not that was in a group context in which they felt that they would have support as well as motivation, or whether or not it was just having somebody to go to the gym with them, or somebody who would go on a walk with them. And some participants talked about how people would say that they would do these things if a participant talked about wanting to be more active, and then they wouldn't actually engage with them, and how demotivating that could be, or how it would start with somebody who would go out with them to do these things, and then that would diminish over time, or potentially diminish depending on what happened to a participant's weight as well. So in part, the reason why participants focused so much on having a safe space in which to engage in physical activity is that some of them had experienced quite traumatic stigma in the past in exercise contexts. For example, one participant talked about having bottles thrown at her when she was jogging. One participant talked about how anytime she was cycling now, she was very nervous about being around any kind of group of children. And Amelia talked about a particularly traumatic experience that she had had maybe 15 years ago, where the hiking club actually left me on a mountain because I couldn't keep up. They said, you can sit here and wait for us to come down and get you, or you can go down by yourself, but you're not coming with us. We're not waiting for you anymore. And Amelia experienced an injury and wound up going into rehabilitation and finding that she really liked working on her fitness. And she developed a far higher level of fitness than she had had in the past. Even with her weight plateauing, she found that this heightened level of fitness made her feel considerably more body accepting. And she talked very highly about her current fitness facility. And toward the end of data collection, she was again doing hikes. But she told me that she did them alone now as a product of this experience, that she still didn't necessarily trust people enough to go on a group hike. So these more positive fitness spaces were far more than just a place for individuals to work out. They led to being highly valued social outlets. Some participants showed me photos of friends that they had made at the gym, and they were engaged with them in other kinds of activities. They could be very mood enhancing for participants to go and engage in physical activity. And again, they could lead to a greater sense of body acceptance, particularly as participants experienced improvements in their fitness and improvements in their health without necessarily having to tie that into body size. The people that I was working with there at her gym were so health focused that helped me to shift and learn and feel potential in being healthy at this weight without feeling like I had to change my weight. So I looked specifically at what participants said were sort of their motivators for physical activity, and what kinds of things came up when participants were talking about their experiences around physical activity specifically. And what I found were that there were three sort of main motivators for physical activity amongst participants. This was protection, including of a functional future, from a fat future and from stigma, pressure, and pleasure. So some participants engaged in physical activity as a way to try and deal with their concerns over aging and mobility and activities of daily life. So again, being able to age in an active way, being able to be independent and to continue in a variety of activities without pain was very important for participants. And for some participants, this is what motivated them to engage in physical activity. And this was often a motivator that led to quite persistent physical activity amongst participants. I don't want to live my life sitting on the couch either. I want to be able to do things with relatives. Like when I first lost my weight and everything, I would go bike riding. My relatives couldn't keep up with me. I would leave them at a park, keep going, come back, pick them up at the park, and go home kind of thing. You want to be able to do all those things and enjoy life. Some participants, particularly those who were trying to maintain weight loss, were really concerned with trying either to not gain any more weight or to not regain weight. And so they engaged in physical activities specifically for the purpose of trying to control their weight. And this could lead to sometimes less persistent physical activity if, for example, participants did wind up regaining weight. Then there really wasn't any advantage they could find to engaging in physical activity. It could just be so demotivating that they might stop engaging in that kind of activity. And then some participants were well aware of the stereotypes around persons of a larger size, and they knew that people looking at them would identify them as being lazy or less motivated just based on appearances and without knowing anything about these individuals' lifestyles. And so for some participants, what they were trying to protect was their identity. And so they were trying to ensure that they weren't viewed as being these lazy, unmotivated persons who didn't engage in physical activity. And they thought that by engaging in physical activity, they could counter some of this stigma that was directed toward them. And of course, it's important to note that these aren't mutually exclusive. Individuals could be motivated by all of these sort of protection, all of these pressure, and all of these pleasure motivations. At any given time, people shifted between them, and many operated in concert. So participants also talked about more pressurized motivations to engage in physical activity. And for some, this could be positive and empowering. This was sort of a way of continuing forward on their health journey, and some of them wound up forming friends with sort of fitness buddies, whether it was online or in person, who could help to motivate them and encourage them to meet their goals. But for some, this could really actually be, they viewed it as being more of a negative compulsion, constantly trying to track and monitor their progress, and then constantly trying to beat their own standards. And they viewed this as being potentially detrimental to meeting their goals as well. Say if I had run 2 miles this week, I wouldn't allow myself to run less than 2 weeks the following week. Getting obsessed with improving something, even though it doesn't need to be, or trying to keep up an artificial standard of, I did this much of this, and therefore I must do this much plus one. And participants who had disordered eating histories in the past often tried to negotiate between wanting to make progress and wanting to track that progress, and to not fall back into behaviors that had really had a negative overall impact on their well-being. And some participants just talked about the innate pleasure of engaging in physical activity, the pleasure that one could experience in moving one's body, in making achievements, and showing somebody else how to do a particular kind of exercise. My daughter, she can be just so down on herself and down on life. And we go to that pool on Wednesday. That Wednesday night's going to be wonderful. And me too. I have more energy. Even though I get tired here, I have more energy. So this is just a graphic that explains sort of some of the relationships between these different motivators. So again, there's that protection of a functional future, where the focus is on exercising in order to ensure one's mobility in old age. That idea of trying to protect oneself from a fat future. Although for some of those participants who focused mostly on weight, they could find that if their fitness and health improved, regardless of what was happening with their weight, they could experience sort of less of a focus on weight loss and more of a focus on specific fitness goals or just on health goals. And this is important, of course, because individuals don't have as much control over their weight as we always tend to assume that they do, and we're just starting to now understand the biology behind this. But individuals started to become more cognizant of this on a personal level as well, that their weight might do things that they don't expect. It might fluctuate, it might plateau, but that didn't necessarily mean that they should stop engaging in physical activity, that there were other benefits of it. So if individuals were trying to protect their identity, obviously if they experienced stigma in a fitness venue, that meant that their physical activity was going to go down. Whereas if they felt accepted in a particular venue, they would persist and continue to engage in physical activity. So that pressure to monitor and make progress for some individuals could be largely empowering. And then for some individuals, it could be disempowering. If they failed in their goals, or for some individuals, it could start to manifest more as this kind of obsessive compulsive behavior that really echoed previous disordered eating behaviors for a lot of participants. And so for some of these participants, they felt that they had to step back and actually attempt to reduce their monitoring behaviors. And sometimes this led to a focus more on sort of a health at every size approach. Or, and this is new to me, but there's also a physical activity every size approach as well. I think that formed out of the UK. But this, for example, led to one of my participants talking about how she no longer felt like she had to go to the gym every day for 2 hours, that some days if she felt like it and it was nice outside, that it was totally okay for her to just go for a walk instead. And then, of course, there was just the pleasure and mastery that participants experienced. And oftentimes this could kind of manifest as being a side effect of being very, very weight-focused and trying to lose weight, for example, or very focused on sort of trying to protect that functional future. If participants started to find that they just enjoyed that activity, it that activity would persist and would become an independent motivator of activity and result in quite persistent physical activity. And there was also pleasure in achievement and pleasure in teaching. Some of my participants taught exercise classes, and all those who showed me a different kind of physical activity certainly were enjoying themselves. So how does my study align with other studies in the area? Certainly, physical functioning has been recognized as a priority for those who are living in larger sizes. And what's important to note is that this is achievable without weight loss. As are other independent health benefits. We know that lipids, blood pressure, and insulin sensitivity, amongst others, can all benefit from physical activity independent of weight loss. And again, this can be important because both myself and other researchers have found that not achieving those weight goals can be very demotivating and is not necessarily something that we have a great deal of control over. Achievement and enjoyment have been recognized by other researchers as being independent motivators for physical activity amongst those of a larger size. And of course, acceptance and diversity in exercise venues is essential. So what do I think the take-home messages are of my research to date? I think we have to recognize obesity as a fluid, contingent, and chronic phenomenon. People don't experience obesity in the same way. And fat people aren't failed thin people who can pass irrevocably into a state of thinness if they just try hard enough. You know, inside every fat person is not a thin person that's just waiting to come out if this person would just put enough effort into it. We really need to start thinking about things like health and fitness in terms of size diversity. We should prioritize functional, mental, and social health. These are the priorities of individuals, including those of a larger size. And we should do what we can to reduce weight discrimination. I know that this is easier said than done, but we can work on establishing that clinician and patient trust, and I would argue also, you know, that fitness professional and client trust. We should work on having safe spaces, so this includes clinical spaces, so feeling safe when you go to your doctor, feeling that you're trusted, that you're not a liar in that context. As well as having exercise venues in which one feels safe, because this has such a profound effect on individuals' health that extended far beyond just physical health. And then to shift the focus away from weight, particularly away from the body mass index, and focus more on health and the kind of holistic health that participants talked about that included, you know, mental and social well-being and physical health that can be measured in multiple different ways and using multiple different kinds of criteria. So I was asked to prepare some questions about things that I'm sort of wondering about. So I wonder, most of my participants were sort of in their middle age, and so they were worried about aging. And I wonder, what do other people think motivates people at different ages to engage in physical activity? So people who are younger, and then people who are already falling into that older adult category. And I'm wondering how popular and accessible are fitness classes for people with larger bodies. I'm trying to remember if I ever saw one in Winnipeg. I think there might have been one. And I know that there's one class run through a few different facilities here in Calgary. But I'm wondering if anyone's ever had any experience with those kinds of classes. And then what are fitness professionals' attitudes towards persons of a larger size and towards the idea of health at every size and sort of the benefits of fitness without weight loss? I've seen one study out of Australia that looked at these issues, but I don't think I've ever seen anything out of Canada. I think the closest I've come across is something that looked at Canadian dietitians' attitudes towards these things. And then how well do people understand the physiological mechanisms of post-dieting weight regain? I sometimes think that if we disseminated these findings more, if people understood the fact that people who are trying to maintain weight loss are actually actively fighting against their bodies all the time. And their bodies are telling them to eat, and their bodies are slowing down their caloric expenditure. That we might have a greater degree of understanding for persons of a larger size if we understood why levels of weight regain are so high, and the degree to which individuals are sort of expected to change their lives in order to try and fit into these normative bodies. That maybe if people understood this more, there would be a reduction in weight bias. So I'd just like to thank always my participants for putting up with me for a full year and teaching me so much. The Manitoba Fitness Council for inviting me to do this webinar. This research was specific to my PhD, so I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Sharon Bruce at the University of Manitoba, and my committee members, Drs. Moss Norman, Deborah McPhail, and Lawrence Elliott, as well as Dr. Megan Warren, who I worked with at the University of Adelaide in Australia. And then, of course, my funding sources. The study was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Manitoba Health Research Council, and the Western Regional Training Centre for Health Services Research. And then the rest of the slides are just my references, which I can always provide. Thank you.